leading us in Bible studies and engaging topics from Jesus' prayers to ancient stories of baby Jesus. You remember that? Earlier this fall, she shared with us her challenges as a guest in a beleaguered Indian Christian community. Just a reminder for a few of you who know her less well, she was born and educated in Canada. Focus of her graduate work was Christianity in the context of Second Temple Judaism and the Greco-Roman world. Someday you're going to have to explain more about that to me. She shifted while at Canadian Mennonite Bible College and now Canadian Mennonite University to focus on the Gospel of John. She came to Goshen to join the Goshen College Bible Department in 1993, and she says she met Joe Springer immediately. Probably there's more story there also that she could tell us. Her son Jacob has lived in Japan the past 10 years. And one more thing she didn't say was that she took an early retirement. But to my eyes, she's never really retired. Both she and Joe are very active at CMC. Joanne continues a very active scholarly life, a bit of which we learned about when she was with us in September. Thanks so much for sharing with us, Joanne, for these 2 Sundays on the Gospel of John, the Sublime and the Ordinary.
I think in your thing it says mundane, but mundane just sounded a little bit negative, so I switched to ordinary. Okay, well, I was invited to speak these 2 Sundays and share about my own research and focus in the Gospel of John. So I'm not going to apologize to those of you who find it too dense. There's some pretty pictures to look at. Okay, but it is a little window into my interests, and to Dell's question about what in the world the Greco-Roman world and Second Temple Jude, this is very much grounded in that interest. And also so my interest in the Gospel of John in the last 10 years has really delved into metaphor, and I'm fascinated by the way the Gospel of John uses imagery, metaphors in order to construct time and space. And so before I stepped out of my job and into the dean's office, I was gearing up for a sabbatical, and a major project on this had lined up some opportunities in Mainz, and then things fell apart. And so I've been plugging away at this in little bits and pieces. And so this is 2 of those pieces that I'm sharing with you. But before I jump in, I want to ask you the question of what in the differences between John and, I should have got a slide here. Where do I have to point to get this to go? It was working. This is no longer. You want to advance the slide for me? I have a lot of slides. So yeah, that's the slide. There we have our little, the differences between John and the synoptics, right? The apples and the oranges. So when you think about these differences, what strikes you as meaningful, or what has caught your attention, and what troubles you, if anything? Like, I know Irvin, things trouble Irvin. But I won't pass the mic around. I'll repeat what people say. Irvin.
I just skimmed the book this morning. It seems to be a book that is obsessed with describing or claiming who Jesus is.
Yeah.
Is that father and son metaphor, the main metaphor?
Yeah.
I don't know what that means.
Okay. Well, maybe not today. Okay. But yeah, the metaphors are really strong. And yeah.
That sounds very Greek to me, you know.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. 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 It sounds alien to the Jewish tradition, to the Old Testament tradition, or it seems like a leap because it's so much, it's not like the metaphor of the son and father that you find in the Old Testament for the kings or the children of God. You're moving to some absolute claims about his status, only begotten son. And how in the world does that work? Other people do like the Gospel of John. Jonathan likes the Gospel of John. And I have to say, the two of you, you know, I usually get to be the youngest person in the room, but you came. Okay. Anything else that comes to mind for people?
Long conversations between Jesus and the disciples about Passion Week.
Yeah, long conversations, and the Passion narrative is almost half the gospel, or half the gospel, and there's a lot of discussion about it in advance. So it really is a gospel focused on Jesus' death from the beginning. There isn't a sort of a wandering around and then a moment when Jesus says, now this part's over and we're heading to Jerusalem. It's always heading towards that. And the threat of death is from the get-go. There's just this tension all the way through the gospel. Well, let's see if I can get this to advance now. There we go. Yeah, attention on the whole between the John and the Synoptics has focused on the high Christology. What Irvin pointed out, the statements that Jesus claims to be equal to God and that salvation is his gift to be given to those who have faith in him. Some people are troubled by this sort of exclusive claim that that Jesus is the only way. But when I look at this difference, I see something a little bit more subtle. And that, yes, here's my picture. Jesus in the Synoptics is very much the eschatological agent. He's bringing the eschaton. He's heralding the beginning of God's reign. And so in the Synoptic Gospels, the first three Gospels, the emphasis is on the coming of God's reign, the coming of God's kingdom. Whereas in John, Jesus isn't just the agent of this eschaton, he is the event. So here's my difference at James Bond. And for those of you who don't know who this is, Taylor Swift, who seems to be the big event in people's lives. This is the only modest picture of her I could find to show. So we have this shift where Jesus is this eschatological event. And so there's all this focus on his person, on his body. And when I look at this, then he's the event, but what John does with the way he crafts his gospel and uses his poetic language, I see also that he's using a form of rhetoric. Or now I got it to work once. Now it's not working again. Maybe that's okay. We got two lovely Greek words up here, where he's using his craft not just to write about history, what was, this telling the story of Jesus, but in his narratives and in the language he's using, he's bringing what was to the present. So while you're reading it, there's this sort of experience of being in the time of the gospel. He's bringing things to your mind's eye through the imagery and the metaphors, so that there's this sort of immediacy of the experience. And you'll notice if you read carefully, there's sort of this blurring of time. When are things happening? Jesus keeps talking about future events as they're happening already, and past events as though they're happening now. And everybody's, so everything is happening all at once in John's gospel. So in my research, I've looked into two forms of rhetoric that were very, very important in the Greco-Roman era in terms of the devices that speakers and writers used. And the two words, fantasia and ekphrasis. Ekphrasis belongs to fantasia, and fantasia sounds like fantasy to us. But in the rhetorical schools, this idea of engaging people's imagination when you spoke was really, really important. Not just the speaker speaking with emotion, but if you could engage people's imaginations, get them involved that way, then this would arouse the right kind of emotional response. So that was what they're aiming at, the right response and the right emotional response. We tend to, because we're from sort of post-Enlightenment era, suspicious about the use of the imagination, where everything has to be sort of scientific and proven. And we find this has created stumbling blocks with the Gospel of John and with our Christology, because we kind of come at this miraculous birth of Jesus with sort of modern biological knowledge and trying to figure out how in the world did it work. Whereas I don't think the ancient audience was all that concerned about how the miraculous worked. So emotions were important. The right emotions are important. And the imagination helps evoke those right emotions. And we know this from children. And why we read certain books to them, to teach them how to feel the right emotions at the right time. And they're doing some of the same thing. So that's the notion of fantasia, or John.
So connecting to.
It's a picture there in the words.
Yeah, so my picture is how books are. I used to tell everybody that the Bible was a pop-up book.
Okay.
No, I found it. You'll see that it's got a watermark. Yeah.
Fantasia.
Well, the whole idea is that in reading, something comes to it's not just words on a page. It's images in your head that come to life. And I think that we have a problem in the modern era in that we have too much imagery. We have too much, and it stifles our imagination sometimes. I think that we're bombarded with images all the time. In the ancient world, people did really rely on this capacity of their imagination. The word ekphrasis, it comes to mean the description of a piece of art in writing. So, but in the ancient world, it's broader than that. It's bringing a picture to mind. And next week, I'll do a little bit more focus on ekphrasis. But ancient writers really were interested in bringing things to mind. I think that my interest in ekphrasis broadly, I love Dickens, and Dickens is just full of this. You read and you can see the people. You can see the action, you can see the rooms in great detail. So this is the methodology that I'm using, or the theories that I'm using. We're going to rely on. Okay, so in the Gospel of John, there's a lot of attention to Jesus' person and his body. And The word axis mundi is a term in religious studies where there are things in this world that connect the earth to the heavens. So the temple is an axis mundi in Judaism, the axis mundi, where heaven and earth meet. And in the Gospel of John, Jesus becomes this axis mundi, and he describes himself at one point as this ladder. Oops, what did my thing? You will see the sky open and God's angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man. And this is an allusion to Jacob's ladder. The image you see is from Bath's Cathedral. I love Bath's Cathedral with the main tower and the ladders going up the side with the angels ascending and descending. So I've chosen that picture. So Jesus is this sort of axis mundi. And when I looked at the language of John in this light, in the light of the way what gets examined and treated this way in the Second Temple literature in Judaism, I realized that the imagery that John is using to evoke Jesus points not to a radical break with his Judaism, but he's playing around within a cultural competence. And it's a cultural competence of being able to play with imagery in such a way where you're dancing really close to the edge of violating that sense of one God without doing it. So coming pretty close to the edge in order to excite these emotions, to bring the sense of presence to mind, to feel like you really are in the presence of the sacred, of God. And Jesus is, in the Gospel of John, this divine presence. So that's what I'm going to present a little bit to you now. I have to watch my time. I do have a timer on. So next slide. So in the Gospel of John, as I mentioned, Jesus' body becomes this axis mundi. And all through the Gospel, John is evoking this image of Jesus as the temple. So the Logos became flesh and dwelt among us, this language of Shekinah, which happily in Greek is there, this divine indwelling, and that happens in the temple. Seeing Jesus' person becomes the means of seeing divine glory. Jesus' prediction that if you destroy this temple, in 3 days I will raise it. And he's talking about the temple of his body. Throughout the gospel, Jesus is being represented as Ezekiel's eschatological body because he provides living water. And he's that site that replaces Gerizim for the Samaritans and Jerusalem's temple. So I think John is writing when the second temple is destroyed already. But this idea that there is going to be another temple and it's Jesus' body. In the tabernacle discourse, Jesus describes himself as the source of water and light. And he says, out of his belly will gush rivers of living water, and I am the light of the world. And these are both temple rituals that he's evoking. And so rather than the temple, then Jesus is the locus of holiness when he claims the one whom the Father sanctifies, and that he is the one that the Father sanctifies and sends into the world. So there's multiple references throughout the gospel that ties Jesus to the temple. Jesus is this axis mundi. He is God's indwelling divine presence in the world. So the next part of this, I'm going to share with you some bits and pieces from the Jewish tradition that I see that John is participating in the same sort of metaphoric cultural competence. And so he's building on or playing with something that other writers have done within Judaism, but they stayed on the line of Judaism, and John he's in that process of moving Christianity away from Judaism. So I don't deny that John kind of crosses the line for most Jews, but I think he's not, yeah, he just sort of tipped over. He didn't jump over the line. So there's three places where I see this in tradition. So you can move to the next slide. And the first one is in the tradition of the body royal. I have a mug with some of this imagery on it. This is from Ravenna. It's the Emperor Justinian and his wife Theodosius. And this idea, how many of you watched the coronation of Charles? We got up early and had tea and scones. And I mean, that imagery is jam-packed with this imagery of the Charles's body being transformed by putting on these robes and holding orbs and staffs and things that all point to this now outdated notion of divine kingship. So we still saw it in his coronation because it's an old ceremony, but this idea of divine kingship that was so important in the ancient Near East, it's not totally absent in Judaism, right? Judaism and the Old Testament, you know that the king is just the guy, infallible, but at the same time, his body is, it gets to be, on occasion, the divine presence. So it's still there in the Old Testament. There's a lovely book written by a fellow by the name of Mark Hamilton called The Body Royal, The Social Politics of Kingship in Ancient Israel and the Levant. And he points to a couple of Psalms, Psalm 110. We can go to the next slide, where the king gets to be the priest in the order of Melchizedek. And this is something that gets picked up in Hebrews to talk about Jesus and Jesus' kingship. And in Psalm 132, where David becomes the temple builder, you think, well, wait a minute, that was Solomon. But in this psalm, David is. And Hamilton points how the royal body becomes in these psalms, he calls it an icon of God's body, and therefore revelatory of the divine realm. So I started looking at other psalms that are used in the Gospel of John, and I found several where this king idea, where the king's body or the king's presence is God's presence. And so I saw it in Psalm 2:6. I've set my king on Zion, my holy hill. So the king is on the Temple Mount. In Psalm 72, may he live while the sun endures and as long as the moon throughout all generations. May he be like rain that falls on mown grass, like showers that water the earth. In his days may righteousness flourish and peace abound until the moon is no more. So you have this sort of eternal kingship coming through, and this gift of water. And the Psalm 118, where the king is the right hand of God. But as we're familiar with that, but as you move through the psalm, there's a whole bunch of other things, like he's the gate through whom the righteous will enter. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. He has given us light. And so you have this image of the king coming through, leading the festival procession, and he really gets elevated into an embodiment of the divine presence in the psalm. So you can see John is drawing from some of this tradition where Jesus as king or Jesus as Lord is participating in a tradition where a human being can be the divine presence during rituals, during festivals and processions. Another place where I looked is in the concept of the priestly body. So next slide. So by the time John is writing his gospel, there haven't been any Israelite kings for a long time that anybody would want to count. The Herodians have been around a while, and nobody's going to write about the Herodians this way. But at this point, the great Jewish scholars, Philo of Alexandria and Flavius Josephus, both spend a great deal of time talking about the body of the priest. And their focus is on the transformation of the body of the priest by the royal vestments. And the passages are rather long. I won't read all of them. But Philo writes about how the normal body of the priest is transformed into a body divine when the vestments are put on. And the linen, he points out, signifies an immortal body because it's not made of wool. It's not made of any animal that dies. Of course, linen dies, but we won't point that out to him. But it's quite lovely. So let's see, I'll read a little bit of it. Yeah. So the priest is commanded to wear another robe also, having very beautiful embroidery and ornament upon it, so that it may seem to be a copy and representation of the world. And the description of the ornament is clear proof of this, for in the first place, the whole of the round robe is of hyacinth color, a tunic reaching to his feet, being an emblem of the air, since the air also is by nature black, and in a manner may be said to be reaching to the feet, as it is extended from above, from the regions about the moon to the lowest places of the earth. So he goes on quite a bit. But you can see what he's doing. I mean, most people don't get to see the high priest. Only those people who can make it to Jerusalem in a pilgrimage. Most Jews would not have been able to do that. And Philo is writing from Alexandria. So he's writing a description in the text that allows them to see this. I'll jump ahead in the rather lengthy quotation from Philo to a passage that might strike your attention. He writes, "It was indispensable for the man who is consecrated to the Father of the world." Oops, I'm losing the grammar here. I have to revise this. It's indispensable that the man who is consecrated to the Father of the world should have as a paraclete his Son, the being most perfect in all virtue, to procure forgiveness of sins and a supply of unlimited blessings. That's the high priest. So we can see in John's treatment of Jesus and his language of the paraclete and the forgiveness of sins, he's not deviating totally from his Judaism. I have to jump ahead. I have things a little out of order.
Hello, and Josephus. How were they connect? How would John connect to them? Did he know about them?
Well, that's a good question. I think John was written in Alexandria. The reason I think that is because he seems to belong to the same thought world as Philo. Though Philo might have been widely read, but Philo is a leader of the Jewish community in Alexandria. Almost all our early manuscript for John comes from Egypt, from Alexandria. Now that might be because it's drier there and better preserved. Tradition has him coming from Ephesus, but I think there's Josephus, he wouldn't have known because Josephus is later, but there are two examples of the way Judaism is able to talk about human bodies. So this is not to say that John is just doing exactly the same thing, but he's doing something similar. One more piece from Philo that I was going to share with you. Okay, talking about the high priest, he says, he's not a man, but a divine word, and immune from all unrighteousness, whether intentional or unintentional. He's a man wholly possessed with the love of God, who serves the living God alone, no longer a man, but actually God, being indeed the God of man, but not the parts of nature. And it gets a little bit dense there. Philo persistently asserts that there's only one God and God is sovereign. And through our friendship with God, we're free. But when he's describing the high priest and his vestments through this sort of ekphrasis, he allows the audience, even momentarily, to be lifted out of their particular time and space, to be in the presence of that power of liberation. So, he's doing something emotional. He's making people feel free. He's making them feel like they're in the divine presence through his prose. Josephus is kind of fun because Josephus actually was a priest, and he participated in the putting on these vestments on the high priest. And you can tell when he writes about it. It sounds very much like he's actually dressing him. Sort of reminds me of in Exodus, when you read the description of the vestments, there are instructions for the seamstress or the tailor. And when you read Josephus, it sounds like instructions for the dresser at a runway fashion show. So it's a little bit different. He writes, first of all, he puts on what are called the machanesis. The word denotes a binder. In other words, drawers covering the loins, stitched fine spun linen, into which the legs are inserted as into breeches. This garment is cut short above the waist and terminates at the thigh, around which it is drawn tight. He kind of goes on at this for great length, so I won't read it all. But then he has, another writer from the time, Aristeas, writes of the high priests. Their appearance makes one awestruck and dumbfounded. A man would think he'd come out of this world into another one. I emphatically assert that every man who comes near the spectacle of what I have described will experience astonishment and amazement beyond words, his very being transformed by the hallowed arrangement of every single detail. So we do have this tradition in Judaism of providing an audience with a mental picture of things and sharing a vision that the author creates in his mind, so that the audience can feel this emotional excitement or astonishment, this sense of being in the presence of the sublime. And I think this is what John is pulling from, this tradition. But then in his exclusive claims about Jesus as being the only way, he does make that break. Okay, so back to Jesus. So on the next slide. Ready? Okay, so throughout, I think what makes John sparkle is this metaphoric language. I am the bread of life. Quote Jesus speaking with a reference to a Old Testament passage, which he claims for himself, out of his belly will gush rivers of living water. I am the light of the world. You do have him representing in his own speech that he is like these high priests, like these royal bodies, in the capacity of one person bringing God's presence into this world through their body, through their presence. So the next part of this, so this is just the density of this argument. I'm skipping over a lot of stuff that might interest you or bore you to tears. But I want to talk a little bit about the time feature of John. I have a long piece that I won't share with you about John's use of prepositions, where and I have this is research I have to substantiate, where this language of time coming to us rather than us going forward in time. But one thing that is interesting then in this representation of this ekphrasis is, what are the emotions we're supposed to feel? It's not just awe. It's not just that there is an emotion that John refers to quite a bit in his gospel that is different. So let's move to the next slide for the giveaway. John, you can hit that. Oops, wait. So I forgot, there's a bit before the emotion. So in the representation of time, in the Gospel of John, if you notice, time is very specific in John. You know where you are in time all the time. And so many things happen during festivals or feasts or Sabbaths. Very little happens in ordinary time in the Gospel of John. So we have a wedding, which is sort of special. And then we have a Passover, a Sabbath, another Passover, an unnamed feast, maybe Pentecost. We have the Festival of Tabernacles, another Sabbath, the Feast of Dedication, and then the Passover again. So things are happening in festival time in this gospel. So now the next slide. And okay, so there is an emotion in Judaism associated with festival time, and that is joy. It's referred to in almost all the authors in Greek as joy. Where is joy here? Oh, there's joy. Joy always makes me feel joyful. I think, oh, her parents just must have known something when they named her Joy. I'm going to make her blush. Okay. So this picture that I've chosen for this is the dancing from Simchat Torah, which is a festival that commemorates the coming of the gift of the Torah, and in the Hasidic tradition, where they take the scrolls and they actually dance with them. But it is a joyful time, and that experience of joy. Philo writes about it at length, about how this experience of what joy is. And for me, why am I a Christian? Has a lot to do with this, that experiences of the sublime through scripture, but also this experience of joy that is different from what our consumer capitalist society tells us we should want. Right? A little story: when my dad moved here, he was very unhappy, and he kept saying, I'm not having any fun. And his big criticism of Joe and I were, we didn't drink, and how can you have fun if you don't drink? You need to be a little tipsy, I guess, to have fun. But I don't think my dad ever experienced joy in his life. Don't think he knew what that is. And joy trumps fun. It's hard to put into language, but if you think about it, when do you feel pure joy? We feel it with our kids and grandchildren, especially grandchildren. Pardon? Oh, yeah. Feel it in our students and the young people. And I think that's because it's also tied with hope, right? You have to have some hope to experience true joy. We experience joy during our Christmas time. We experience it at the celebration of the resurrection. And again, both tied with hope. there has to be that promise, there has to be that hope that helps us experience what joy is. And there's this recognition of this in Jewish writing. And so this emotion that John is trying to help evoke and bring forth through our imagination is deeply rooted in the Jewish experience of time. And, and Philo, when he writes about why we have these festivals, is that it's a time, he says, where is continuous fearlessness and peace, unimaginable blessing, enjoying perfect tranquility. So it's fleeting, but it's a taste of what is to come. So it's not just a happy ending, or it's not, even for Philo, not a byproduct of virtue, which it would be in the Greco-Roman tradition. You're happy if you're virtuous, but it's an occasion. Joy is an occasion, and it gives rise then to an expression of virtue. We act out of that sense of joy. We don't just experience it because we're good. If you ever have this problem of, have I got the right motivation for my goodness, right? Am I just doing it so everybody says I'm good, or I'm told I have to be good? Focus on the joy, and then the goodness will follow. And it's also linked, of course, to freedom. So it's so important that in the Jewish tradition that slaves experience this festival time. They're not slaves on the Sabbath. So that they can experience that freedom that comes with joy. So let's see, how am I doing for time? I'm doing very well, so there'll be some time for questions. So if we look at the next slide, which is a very busy slide, the kind of slide you're never supposed to show, it just is a way of demonstrating how present this language is in the Gospel of John of joy. That, I come to bring you exceeding joy. My prayer is that you have my joy made complete in yourself. And I think this is why I really like the Gospel of John, is this, that it tells us it's doing something. It's helping us get there to this sense of joy, this feeling of Jesus' presence, and participating in this joy. And we see snatches of this other places, like in the Beatitudes, but I think John, through his artistry, that is doing something else, and quite successfully. So these emotions he's trying to educate us to are very Jewish emotions, and I think we need to remember that. And even though he's breaking away from Judaism in his claims of Jesus being that eschatological fulfillment, he's not breaking away from Judaism in his rhetoric or in his use of the imagination and his use of metaphors, and certainly not in what he's trying to educate our imagination to be. So I know that it kind of troubles people that I tend to look at the gospel as an aesthetic object, and rather than looking at its theology and Christology. But I'm seeing Jonathan smile because this is his thing, and we people who write music for the church know that this is what they're trying to do, and sometimes get very successful, and other times not as successful, but we try. And if you haven't heard the Rain Down song, that's not the title of the song, which is the song that you're Rain Down, that's a hymn, but the Waterfall song, that's it, the Waterfall song, where that's one song that Jonathan came very close to perfection, I think. People, it makes them feel that joy. It does what it's supposed to do. And today we heard a song. Did you write today's song? Yeah, where it took us on an emotional journey. But I love the fact as we that it used color, right, to do that. And so it was doing not with the sounds simply, but with the imagery, getting you in this journey of through the use of color. And so you came, you have to pay by drawing attention to you at the end in conclusion. So, the gospel is seeking to inspire people. It's inspiring them to stay firm in the decisions that they've made, to cast their lot in with what he claims to be the winning side, even though lots of the time it doesn't feel like we're winning, right? These days, those of us who advocate for a gospel of peace feel pretty discouraged. But he's using the strategies at hand, and they really did. They have worked for thousands of years, and hopefully will continue if we can set aside that nagging scientific brain that we inherited from the Enlightenment and let the art do what the art does. And that's my presentation for you. So there's some time for questions if people have them, according to my phone. Oh, you can put a nice pretty slide up for the last one. There, there's our hope and joy. This is actually the logo from bakery. I thought it was so appropriate. Looking for peace, hope, and joy. And then I found that giving is a piece of cake up from a bakery. So that seemed appropriate for the Gospel of John, since Jesus is the bread of life. There's no donuts. No. There's coffee. So any questions about that? Now you're all wondering, what does Joanne just spend her time thinking about? But
So, I'm going back to the very beginning when you asked sort of what's our visceral response to John as a whole.
And for me, part of
What I love about it is it feels more abstract and mysterious to me than some. I know some of that is just that, like, the whole philosophical context of it is different than our philosophical context, and even like the idea of what is the word, and the word is this and the word is that. But I feel like even though in the Christianity as we've inherited it at this time, there's sort of like a certain interpretations of that. Like when I read it, it feels very mysterious and abstract and big and strange.
yeah.
And I'm wondering, like, yeah, do you have any comments just about that?
Yeah, well, we're rereaders. We've heard this text a lot. So I like people to imagine never having heard the gospel before. Okay, I gave myself 5 minutes. And it begins in the beginning. And this is, you're not reading this. Somebody stood up and began reciting, in all likelihood, because not everybody, copies of this would float around. Somebody would be appointed to memorize it, and then it would be passed on to another community. Paul's letters were pricey little things, and gospel's even more expensive at the time. And so somebody gets up and they start saying, in the beginning, and you fill it in. And you're not going to fill it in with was the word, you're going to fill it in with some tohu and bohu, and the beginning of Genesis. So right away, John's rhetorical strategy is to tip you, to make you a little off balance. Yeah, to start you wondering. In this engagement of wondering, and in that long prologue, it's, where I'm sure people kind of guessed where he was leading, but he's so indeterminate until he gets to the end of it. And we really don't have a clear sense of a naming of Jesus until quite a ways in. And there's all sorts of places where the play on words that he does with this. One thing that I really bothered by some translations, or maybe I shouldn't say this, that the choice of the translation for the Anabaptist Bible gets rid of the indeterminacy of John's language. So in my little side notes, I point out every place where they've made a choice and you shouldn't make it. It's leaving, where does he, which one is it? Which one is it? All the way through. So there is he's doing this quite intentionally. But then he does bring it to resolutions so that you feel a sense of confidence. So you move from indeterminacy to confidence. And I think that's part of his rhetorical strategy. And an audience that probably liked that play with language, where we aren't as used to that play with language. And especially this last generation where eloquence has just gone out the window. Our presidents speak like, I don't know. Well, even, it's gone. I hope maybe it'll come back again.